Homeless at 19, she inherited an abandoned creamery. What she found inside changed everything. This is a story about how the things we inherit aren't always about money, and how a second chance can be found in the most broken of places. If you believe in finding hope in the ruins, stick around and consider subscribing. You're in the right place. The day I turned 19 was the day I ceased to be a problem for the state of Oregon. It wasn't a celebration. There was no cake, no off-key singing. There was just a cardboard box containing 2 changes of clothes, a worn-out copy of a book I'd read 100 times, a toothbrush, and a manila envelope. My caseworker, a woman named Sharon whose face was a permanent landscape of tired empathy, handed it to me in the sterile entryway of the group home. "That's it, Maya," she said, her voice attempting a cheerfulness that didn't reach her eyes. "You're officially an adult." The word felt like a badly fitting code, stiff and foreign. For the last 7 years, since my grandmother had been moved into a state facility, I had been a file number, a ward, a series of appointments and evaluations. I hadn't made a single decision about my own life bigger than what to eat for breakfast from the 2 approved cereal options. Now, I was an adult, which apparently meant I was qualified to be homeless. The manila envelope was the only thing in the box that was new. It had my name on it, typed neatly. Inside was a bus ticket and another, smaller envelope, sealed with a strip of yellowing tape. "Your grandmother left this for you," Sharon explained, pointing at the smaller one. "It was in her file, with instructions to be given to you on your 19th birthday. The ticket, that was arranged by her estate's lawyer, estate. Another word that felt like it belonged to a different life. My grandmother, Nana, had spent the last 5 years of her life in a place that smelled of bleach and quiet desperation, her mind a tangled attic of memories she could no longer access. What kind of estate could she have? Sharon gave me $100 in cash, a final parting gift from the system, and a list of shelters in Portland. She patted my shoulder. The touch was meant to be comforting, but it felt like a final push out the door. "Good luck, Maya." I didn't say thank you. I didn't say anything. I just picked up my box and walked out into the thin morning drizzle. The world felt vast and terrifying. The bus station was a symphony of anxious motion, people rushing toward lives I couldn't imagine. I found my gate and sat on a hard plastic chair, my box clutched to my chest like a shield. The bus ticket was one way to a place called Black Creek. I'd never heard of it. A quick search on the station's spotty Wi-Fi told me it was a small town in the coastal range, a place that time and the interstate had mostly forgotten. Population, 847. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a ticket to a new life. It was a ticket to the middle of nowhere. I stared at the smaller envelope. Nana's handwriting, spidery and frail from her last good years, spelled out my name. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to open it. My relationship with my grandmother was a book with the last chapter ripped out. I remembered warm hands smelling of soil and yeast, a low humming voice that could soothe any scraped knee, a garden overflowing with unruly roses. Then I remembered the confusion, the blank stares, the day the men in uniforms came. The system told me she'd forgotten me, that she was too sick to be my guardian. They made it sound simple, clean, a medical necessity. But to a 12-year-old, it felt like the most profound betrayal. It felt like abandonment. Now, here was a ghost, a final word from a woman I had tried so hard to forget. With trembling fingers, I broke the tape. Inside was a single, heavy, old-fashioned iron key and a short, handwritten note. The handwriting was stronger here, from an earlier time. "My dearest Maya," it read. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you are grown. I am so sorry for the silence. I hope one day you'll understand it was the only way I could protect you. The key is for the front door. Go to Black Creek. See Mr. Albridge. He will explain. Whatever you find, know it was all for you. It's your home, if you still want one. All my love, Nana." Home. The word was a punch to the gut. My home had been a series of beige rooms and shared bathrooms. My home was a file in a cabinet. This key, heavy and cold in my palm, felt like a lie. Or worse, a cruel joke. What home? The crumbling farmhouse we'd lived in had been sold to pay for her care years ago. I knew that for a fact. The bus hissed to a stop at my gate, its doors sighing open. People began to line up, their faces set with the grim determination of travelers. I had a choice. I could tear up the ticket, tear up the note, and take my $100 to a shelter in Portland. I could become another statistic, another kid aged out and lost. Or I could get on that bus. I could go to Black Creek and face the ghost of a woman I wasn't sure I could ever forgive. I looked down at the key in my hand. It was ornate, belonging to a door far grander than any I remembered. It was a question, cast in iron. I didn't know if I wanted the answer, but it was the only thing I had. I stood up, my joints stiff. I left the cardboard box on the chair. All I took with me was the manila envelope, the $100, and the key. I got on the bus. The journey to Black Creek was a slow crawl away from everything I knew. The city's dense grid of concrete and glass gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to stretches of highway flanked by sodden green fields. The bus was mostly empty, and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the wet pavement was the only sound. I watched the landscape change, the Douglas firs growing thicker, the hills starting to roll and swell like a deep green ocean. The sky was a uniform, pearly gray, weeping a steady, miserable rain that matched my mood. I kept my hand in my pocket, wrapped around the iron key. Its cold, solid weight was a constant reminder of the absurdity of my situation. I was a 19-year-old girl with no job, no friends, no family, and $100 to my name. On my way to a town I'd never heard of to claim an inheritance from a grandmother who had, by all accounts, died with nothing. It felt less like a new beginning and more like the setup for a very bleak novel. The note was a puzzle I couldn't solve. It was the only way I could protect you. Protect me from what? From her illness? The state had already done that. From poverty? We were always poor, but we were happy, weren't we? The memories were fuzzy, seen through the distorting lens of childhood. I remembered the scent of her baking bread, the feel of dirt under my fingernails from helping in her garden. I remembered her stories, fantastical tales of talking animals, and hidden kingdoms she'd spin while we sat on the porch swing. But I also remembered worried conversations on the phone, hushed voices after I'd gone to bed. I remembered envelopes with red-lettered warnings that she would quickly hide when I entered the room. I had been a child. I hadn't understood the texture of our life, only its color. And its color had been warm, until it wasn't. The bus driver, a burly man with a kind, tired face, occasionally glanced at me in his rearview mirror. He probably saw what everyone saw, a runaway, a kid in trouble. He probably had me pegged for a dozen different sad stories, and he wouldn't be entirely wrong. After a few hours, he called back. Black Creek, next stop. About 15 minutes out, my heart, which had been beating in a dull, steady rhythm, began to pound. The name on the note, Mr. Albridge, was my only point of contact. The note didn't include an address or a phone number. I was banking on the fact that in a town of 847 people, a lawyer named Albridge wouldn't be hard to find. The bus slowed, turning off the main highway onto a narrower road that wound its way through a thick curtain of forest. The rain had eased to a fine mist, hanging in the air like smoke. Then, the trees parted, and the town appeared. Black Creek wasn't so much a town as a huddle of buildings against the wilderness. A single main street was lined with two-story structures, their facades a mix of weathered brick and faded paint. There was a diner with a flickering neon sign, a general store, a gas station with old-fashioned pumps, and a handful of other shops that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1970s. It was quiet, eerily so. The bus pulled up in front of the general store, which apparently doubled as the town's bus depot. "This is it, kid," the driver said, his voice softer now. "You sure you're in the right place?" "I think so," I lied. He gave me a look, a mixture of pity and concern. "Store's open for another hour if you need anything." "Good luck." I stepped off the bus and into the damp, heavy air. It smelled of wet asphalt, pine needles, and wood smoke. The bus pulled away with a groan, leaving me in an almost profound silence. I was the only person on the street. For a moment, a wave of panic washed over me. This was a mistake. A huge, irreversible mistake. I should have stayed in Portland. I could be in a shelter right now, anonymous and safe in my misery. Here, I felt exposed, a single wrong note in a quiet, old song. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. Panicking wouldn't help. I had a name. Mr. Albridge. I walked into the general store. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, out-of-place sound. The inside was a warm, cluttered maze of packed shelves. It smelled of coffee, sawdust, and old paper. A woman with a cloud of white hair and sharp, Curious eyes looked up from behind the counter. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked. Her gaze swept over me, taking in my thin jacket, my worn jeans, my lack of luggage. "I'm looking for a lawyer," I said, my voice sounding small. "A Mr. Albridge." The woman's eyebrows shot up. "Arthur Albridge?" "Sure. His office is just down the street, above the old post office. But he's a bit of a character." "You in some kind of trouble?" "I don't think so," I said. "He's handling an estate for my grandmother." The curiosity in her eyes softened into something else. "Recognition. Your grandmother. You must be Maya." From the letters, my blood ran cold. "What letters?" "Oh, Arthur's been talking about you for years. Said you'd be coming one day, when you were of age. He handles things for, well, for the old creamery." She pointed out the window, down a side street. "You're Eleanor's girl, Eleanor." Hearing her name spoken aloud was a shock. It had been years. "Yes," I managed to say. "I'm her granddaughter." The woman, whose name tag read June, came around the counter. She was shorter than I was, but seemed to take up more space. "Well, I'll be. It's good to finally meet you." We all wondered. "Arthur's office is the one with the green door. You can't miss it. He's usually there late." I thanked her and walked back out into the gray afternoon. The old creamery. The name meant nothing to me. Nana had worked as a cleaner at the local school, and she'd tended her garden. She'd never mentioned a creamery. I found the green door June had described. A small, tarnished brass plate read, "Arthur Albridge, attorney at law." I took a steadying breath and walked up the creaking wooden stairs. The air grew stuffy, smelling of dust and old books. His office was at the top of the landing, the door slightly ajar. I could hear a low murmur of a voice inside. I knocked. The voice stopped. "It's open," a gruff voice called out. I pushed the door open and stepped into a room that looked as ancient as the town itself. Books were stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. The air was thick with the smell of pipe tobacco and paper. Behind a massive oak desk, piled high with files, sat a man who seemed to be made of tweed and wrinkles. He had a shock of white hair that stood up in tufts, and thick glasses perched on the end of his nose. He peered at me over them. "Well," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you have your grandmother's eyes. You must be Maya." Arthur Albridge gestured to a worn leather chair opposite his desk. I sat, the leather sighing under my weight. The chair had probably held generations of Black Creek citizens as they discussed wills, property disputes, and divorces. It felt heavy with the town's secrets. "I got your letter," I said, pulling the note and the key from my pocket and placing them on the one clear spot on his desk. "Or my grandmother's letter." He picked up the key, his gnarled fingers turning it over. "Ah, yes. The key to the kingdom." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. Eleanor always was dramatic. He looked at me, his gaze sharp and assessing. "She made me promise. On your 19th birthday, you get the letter and the ticket." No sooner. She was very specific about what. I asked, "Why am I here?" "The note mentions a home." I thought everything was sold. Mr. Albridge leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning in protest. He took a pipe from a stand on his desk and began methodically packing it with tobacco. The ritual seemed to give him time to arrange his thoughts. "Your grandmother was a very strategic woman, Maya. When her mind started to go, she knew she couldn't care for you. And she knew her illness would be expensive. The farmhouse, the garden, yes, that was all sold to pay for her long-term care. She made sure that debt was settled." He lit the pipe, and a plume of sweet-smelling smoke filled the small office. "But she had one other asset. Something she had acquired years before, when her husband, your grandfather, was still alive. Something she couldn't bear to part with, but also something that was, at the time, a liability." He paused, taking a long draw from his pipe. "She transferred the deed into a trust for you, with me as the trustee. The terms were simple. The trust would hold the property until you turned 19, at which point it would become yours. Entirely." My mind was reeling. An asset? A property? What property? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Albridge pointed with the stem of his pipe towards the window, in the same direction the store owner, June, had indicated. "The old Black Creek Creamery," he said, as if this should mean something to me. "Your grandmother and grandfather bought it back in the 80s. It was their dream. They were going to make artisanal cheese, supply the whole region. It was a thriving business for a while. Then your grandfather passed, the market changed, and, well, Dreams don't always pay the bills. The Creamery. I tried to conjure an image, but there was nothing. Nana had never spoken of it. It was a hole in her history, a chapter one never knew existed. So, I own a creamery. The words sounded ridiculous. He gave me a wry smile. You own a building. A very large, very old, very empty building. And, I'm afraid, its associated debts. My brief, flickering hope guttered out. Debts, property taxes, mostly, he said, shuffling through a mountain of paper on his desk and pulling out a thick file. He opened it, revealing columns of figures and official-looking documents stamped with red warnings. Eleanor managed to prepay them for a few years after she set up the trust, but that money ran out long ago. The county has placed several liens on the property. As of today, you owe just over $12,000 in back taxes and penalties. $12,000. The number was so large it was almost meaningless. I had $97 to my name after buying a bottle of water at the bus station. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a trap. And if I can't pay it? I asked, already knowing the answer. The county will seize the property and sell it at auction to recoup the taxes, he said calmly. The auction is scheduled for 90 days from now. He saw the look on my face, the collapse of my composure. His expression softened. However, there is another option. There's a development firm, a company called Cascade Holdings. They've been trying to buy that land for years. They want to tear down the creamery and put up luxury cabins for tourists. They've made a standing offer. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a formal offer letter. My eyes scanned the numbers, my brain struggling to process them. They were offering $200,000. They're offering that much for a derelict building with a huge tax bill. They're not offering it for the building, Mr. Albridge corrected gently. They're offering it for the land. It's a prime parcel, right on the creek. They've been buying up properties all around here. Their offer would more than cover the back taxes. After my fees, you'd walk away with, about $175,000. Free and clear, $175,000. It was a fortune. It was a new life. It was a plane ticket to anywhere. It was safety, security, an apartment, a future. It was everything I had never had. All I had to do was sign a piece of paper. Let them tear down a building I'd never seen, a place that held a dream I'd never known. It was the smart choice. The only choice. Why didn't my grandmother just sell it herself? I asked, the question tasting like suspicion. She could have used that money for her care. She wouldn't have had to. I trailed off. Had to what? Give me up? Because she hated them, Mr. Albridge said simply. Cascade Holdings. They played hardball when the creamery was failing. They tried to strong-arm her into selling for pennies on the dollar. She never forgave them. She would rather have seen the place fall into the sea than sell it to them. She wanted you to have it. She wanted you to have the choice. The word echoed in my head. A choice to take the money and run, or a choice to what? Take on a failing building and a mountain of debt I could never hope to pay? It wasn't a choice. It was an illusion. I'll need to think about it, I said, my voice flat. Mr. Albridge nodded slowly. Of course. In the meantime, you'll need a place to stay. The creamery has a small apartment upstairs where your grandparents used to live. It hasn't been touched in years, but the power and water are still connected. I've been paying the minimum utility bills out of the trust's residual funds. It's not much, but it's dry. He handed me the heavy iron key. This is for the main gate. This other one, he added, detaching a smaller, shinier key from his own ring, is for the apartment upstairs. I had a new lock put on a while back. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. My mind was a whirlwind of numbers, choices, and emotions. I was angry at my grandmother for leaving me this mess, for her stubborn pride. I was heartbroken for the dream she'd lost. And I was terrified of the decision that now rested squarely on my shoulders. Thank you, Mr. Albridge, I said, the words automatic. Call me Arthur, he said. And Maya, before you decide anything, you should go see the place. Really see it. I walked out of his office and back down the creaking stairs, the two keys now in my hand. The rain had stopped, and a weak, watery sunlight was breaking through the clouds. I followed the side street June had indicated, my boots echoing on the empty pavement. And then I saw it. It was a monster. The Black Creek Creamery wasn't just a building. It was a sprawling, industrial relic that consumed an entire block. It was a fortress of faded red brick and rusting corrugated metal, its roofline a jagged collection of vents and pipes silhouetted against the gray sky. A high, chain-link fence topped with barbed wire surrounded the entire property, a stern and unwelcoming perimeter. A large, faded sign hanging precariously from two chains read Black Creek Creamery below it. In smaller, peeling letters, was the slogan. The taste of the coast, the whole place sagged with an air of profound neglect. Windows were boarded up or broken, revealing dark, gaping interiors. Weeds grew thick and wild along the foundation, reclaiming the concrete for the forest. It didn't look like a dream. It looked like a tomb. A massive, rolling gate, secured with a heavy chain and padlock, was the only entrance. This was what the big iron key was for. It slid into the rusty lock with a grating sound. It took all my strength to turn it, the metal groaning in protest. With a final, shuddering click, the lock sprang open. The gate rolled back on its track with a scream of tortured metal, opening a gap just wide enough for me to slip through. I was in. The air inside the fence was different, still, and heavy with the smell of decay. A cracked asphalt yard separated the fence from the main building. Puddles of brown water stood in the low spots. I walked toward the main entrance, a set of large double doors made of heavy, weathered wood. Above them, a single, grime-covered light fixture hung like a dead spider. There was no keyhole. These were the loading bay doors, not a front entrance. I followed the brick wall, my hand trailing against its cold, rough surface. I passed boarded-up windows and rusting metal conduits that snaked up the side of the building. I found a smaller, single door tucked away in an alcove. It had a simple, modern lock. Arthur's new lock. The apartment. The small key slid in smoothly. I turned it, and the bolt clicked back. I pushed the door open and was met with a wall of cold, stale air. It led to a narrow, steep staircase. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk back to Arthur's office, sign the papers, and never look back. This place was a burden. A weight. But Nana's words echoed in my mind. Whatever you find, know it was all for you. I had to see it. I had to understand. I closed the door behind me, plunging the stairwell into near darkness, and began to climb. The apartment was at the top of the stairs. It was small, just a few rooms, and it was a time capsule. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but it was otherwise undisturbed. There was a small living area with a floral sofa and a boxy television set, a tiny kitchen with yellow Formica countertops, and a bedroom with a single bed neatly made. It felt like its occupants had just stepped out for a moment, 20 years ago, and never returned. It was cold, but as Arthur had promised, it was dry. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps silent on the linoleum floors. On the nightstand in the bedroom, there was a framed photograph, face down. I picked it up. It was a picture of a young couple, laughing, standing in front of the creamery. But it wasn't the decaying hulk I had just seen. It was new, vibrant. The sign was freshly painted, the windows gleamed, and there were flowers planted by the entrance. The man had his arm around the woman. My grandfather, his face crinkled in a wide smile. And Nana, she looked so young, so full of life and hope. This was the dream. This was what they had built. I felt a lump form in my throat. This wasn't just a derelict property. It was their life. I set the photo back down and continued my exploration. There was another door in the small living area. It was made of heavy steel, with a small, barred window at eye level. It looked like it led directly into the main factory. A heavy bolt was slid shut. I wrestled with the bolt, my fingers stiff with cold. It finally slid back with a loud clang that echoed in the quiet apartment. The door swung inward, opening into a vast, cavernous darkness. The smell that hit me was overwhelming. It was a cold, metallic, sour smell. The smell of old milk, industrial cleaning agents, and rust. I fumbled for a light switch just inside the door, my fingers searching the cold wall. I found a bank of heavy-duty switches and flipped one. Nothing. I tried another. And another. On the fourth try, a section of long, fluorescent lights flickered to life with a hum, casting a sterile, buzzing glow over a portion of the room. I was standing on a metal catwalk overlooking the main processing floor. The space was immense, the ceiling 2 stories high, crisscrossed with pipes and conduits. Below me, silent and gleaming under a thick coat of dust, was the machinery. Huge, stainless steel vats, a web of pipes, conveyor belts, and control panels with gauges like dead eyes. It was a ghost factory, an industrial skeleton. It was terrifying and, in a strange way, beautiful. The scale of it was hard to comprehend. How could two people, my grandparents, have dreamed something this big? I followed the catwalk, my footsteps ringing in the silence. The lights I'd turned on only illuminated one section of the factory. The rest was lost in shadow, hinting at more rooms, more machinery, more secrets. The catwalk led to a set of stairs that descended to the main floor. I walked down, my hand trailing on the cold metal railing. On the floor, I was dwarfed by the machinery. I ran my hand over the side of one of the giant vats. It was cold as ice. I could see my own distorted reflection in its dusty surface. I looked like a ghost myself. I wandered through the maze of equipment, feeling like an archaeologist in a lost city. It was clear the place had been shut down in a hurry. A clipboard with a work order still hung on a hook. A pair of rubber boots stood by a floor drain, as if their owner had just stepped out of them. It was in the far corner of the main room, in the deepest shadow, that I saw it. Another door. This one was different. It was an office. A small, glass-walled room built into the corner of the factory floor. It looked like the nerve center of the whole operation. I walked towards it, my boots crunching on something. I looked down. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dried, cracked paper. Mail. Hundreds of letters, scattered and trampled, stretching from the mail slot in the office door. I knelt and picked one up. It was a bill. The next one was a warning from the bank. The next, a letter from a supplier, demanding payment. It was a paper trail of failure. The story of a dream dying. I reached the office door. It was locked. Through the grimy glass, I could see a desk, a chair, a filing cabinet. And on the desk, almost buried under more scattered papers, was a small, wooden box. It seemed to be the only thing in the entire factory that wasn't covered in a thick layer of dust. It was clean, as if someone had been there recently, or as if it was waiting. Something inside me knew. Whatever answers I was looking for, they were in that office. In that box. I was no longer just exploring a building. I was on a hunt. I had to get inside that room. Finding a way into the locked office became an obsession. The door was solid, the lock robust. I rattled the handle, but it was firm. I peered through the grimy window again, my gaze fixed on the wooden box. It was the only object in the entire building that felt intentional, placed. It was a destination. I remembered the heavy iron key in my pocket. Nana's key. It was too large and ornate for this simple office door, but on a hunch, I tried it anyway. It didn't even fit in the lock. I spent the next hour searching for a hidden key, a spare tucked under a loose floor tile or on a high ledge. I ran my hands along the dusty tops of machinery, peered into dark corners, and checked under the frames of the conveyor belts. Nothing. The factory was a cold, silent tomb, and it wasn't giving up its secrets easily. Defeated and shivering, I retreated back up to the apartment. The cold was seeping into my bones, and the initial adrenaline of discovery was wearing off, replaced by a deep, gnawing exhaustion. I needed to get warm. I needed to think. In the tiny kitchen, I tried the faucet. After a few seconds of sputtering and groaning, a stream of rusty water flowed out, eventually clearing. It was freezing cold, but it was water. The stove was an old electric model. I turned a knob, and to my amazement, one of the coils began to glow a dull, angry red. Power. I filled a dusty pot with water and set it on the glowing coil, hoping to make something warm to drink. There was no tea, no coffee, only a few hardened packets of sugar in a cupboard. Hot sugar water it was. As I waited for the water to heat, I paced the small apartment, my mind racing. The offer from Cascade Holdings felt like a lifeline. $175,000. The number was a mantra of escape. I could be on a plane tomorrow, heading for a warm city, a new identity, a life without the ghosts of Black Creek. All I had to do was give up. But then I'd see the photograph of my grandparents, their faces alight with hope. I'd see the vast, silent cathedral of the factory floor. And I'd see the wooden box, waiting for me in its dusty sanctuary. Giving up felt like a betrayal, not just of Nana, but of a part of myself I was only just discovering. The water began to steam. As I reached for the pot, my eyes fell on a small, cluttered corkboard on the kitchen wall. It was covered in old grocery lists, appointment reminders, and a few faded postcards. It was the mundane debris of a life. Tucked behind a yellowed newspaper clipping about a county fair, something caught my eye. A small, brass key hanging on a thumbtack. It was small, plain, the kind of key that could belong to anything. A diary, a toolbox, a filing cabinet, or an office door. My heart hammered against my ribs. I snatched the key from the board and, forgetting the hot water, ran out of the apartment, down the narrow stairs, and back into the cavernous factory. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, eerie shadows. I crossed the main floor, my steps echoing, the key clutched in my hand. I reached the office door, my breath clouding in the cold air. With a trembling hand, I inserted the key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. I turned it. There was a soft, satisfying click. The lock was open. I pushed the door and stepped inside. The air in the office was even colder and more stale than the factory. The desk was a chaotic landscape of invoices, ledgers, and threatening letters from the bank. But my focus was entirely on the wooden box. It was simple, made of dark, polished cherry wood, about the size of a shoebox. It had no lock, just a simple brass clasp. I lifted the lid. The inside was lined with faded blue velvet, and it was filled with letters. Dozens of them, tied in neat bundles with faded ribbon. They were all addressed to me, in Nana's familiar, spidery script. On top of the first bundle was a single, untied envelope. It just said, "Read this first." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. I unfolded the pages. The letter was dated shortly after she had been placed in the care facility, but the handwriting was still strong, lucid. "My dearest Maya," it began. "If you are reading this, then Arthur has kept his promise, and you have found your way here. I know you must be angry with me. I know you must feel that I abandoned you. I need you to know that the silence, the distance, it was a shield. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, but I did it to save you." I sat down in the dusty office chair, my legs suddenly weak. The sterile, bureaucratic explanation I'd been given for my grandmother's absence had been replaced by this, a voice from the grave, filled with a pain I was only just beginning to understand. "The Creamery was our life, your grandfather's and mine. When he died, I tried to keep it going for him, for you. But I was not a business person. I made mistakes. I borrowed money from the wrong people. Not just the bank, Maya. People who don't send polite letters when you fall behind. A man named Silas Croft, he owned a transport company. He seemed like a savior at first, offering me a loan to keep the business afloat. But his interest rates were criminal. I was trapped. The debt grew, and so did his threats. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about taxes and bad business decisions. This was something darker. He started threatening to harm you, Maya. Subtle things at first. Comments about how pretty you were, how he knew your route home from school. He wanted the Creamery. He knew it had value, not for the business, but for the land and the water rights. He was connected to those developers, Cascade Holdings. He was their predator, sent to bleed me dry so they could pick up the pieces for cheap. I went to the police, but they couldn't do anything without proof. It was my word against his. When my health started to fail, I knew I was running out of time. I couldn't protect you anymore. My illness, it turned out, was a strange kind of gift. By going into state care, by having you placed in the foster system, I was putting you somewhere he couldn't reach. The state became your guardian, your protector. He couldn't touch you there. It was the only way. I had to let you go to keep you safe. I had to let you hate me so you could live. I dropped the letter onto the desk, a choked sob escaping my throat. Tears streamed down my face, hot against my cold skin. All the years of bitterness, the carefully constructed narrative of abandonment, it all shattered. It wasn't betrayal. It was a sacrifice. A terrible, desperate, brutal act of love. She hadn't thrown me away. She had hidden me. I cried for the scared little girl who thought her grandmother had forgotten her. I cried for the lonely teenager who had built a wall around her heart. And I cried for Nana, alone in her fading mind, carrying the weight of this terrible choice. The story I had told myself about my life was a lie, and the truth was so much more painful and so much more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. After a long time, my sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. The cold of the office seeped back into my awareness. I looked at the box of letters, the neat bundles tied with ribbon. This was just the beginning. This was just the first page. There was a whole history here, a whole life I knew nothing about. For the first time, the thought of selling, of taking the money and running, felt wrong. It felt like letting Silas Croft and Cascade Holdings win. It felt like spitting on my grandmother's sacrifice. I picked up the letter again, my fingers tracing her words. "This place is your inheritance, Maya," she had written on the final page. "Not the debt, not the building. The choice. You can sell it and build a new life, far away from here. There is no shame in that. It is more money than we ever had. Or you can stay. You can fight. I don't know what the right answer is, but I know the choice had to be yours." I looked around the dusty office, at the silent factory beyond the glass. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a battlefield. It was a legacy, and it was mine. Now, if you've made it this far into the story, something in it must be resonating with you. Maybe it's the feeling of being lost, or the shock of discovering that the stories we've been told aren't the whole truth. Have you ever inherited something that wasn't about money, but about a choice or a responsibility? I read all the comments, and I'd be honored to hear a piece of your story. This community is for people who understand that the most valuable things are often the most complicated. If that's you, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's get back to the creamery. I spent the rest of that day and all of the next in that cold, dusty office, devouring my grandmother's letters. They were not chronological. They were a mosaic of memory, confession, and advice, written over the years she was in care, during her brief moments of lucidity. I pieced together the story of the creamery, of her life, of my own history. I learned that my grandfather, David, had been the dreamer. He was the one who saw the abandoned building and envisioned a place of creation. He was the cheesemaker, the artist. Nana was the pragmatist, the one who managed the books and ran the small storefront they had at the front of the building. Her letters were filled with love for him, a deep, abiding partnership that was the foundation of everything. His death from a sudden heart attack had shattered her world and left her alone at the helm of a business she didn't fully understand. That's when Silas Croft had appeared. She described him in chilling detail, a man with a smile that never reached his eyes, who spoke in a low, friendly tone that was laced with menace. He was a vulture, circling a business he knew was wounded. The loan she took from him was the anchor that dragged the creamery to the bottom. Her letters detailed her frantic attempts to stay afloat, working 18-hour days, selling her own wedding ring, firing the few employees they had until it was just her. She wrote about the shame, the feeling of failing her husband's memory. She wrote about her growing fear of Croft, his visits becoming more frequent, his veiled threats more explicit. One letter, stained with what I realized were teardrops, described the day he followed me home from school. He didn't approach me. He just parked his dark sedan across the street from our little farmhouse and watched. When Nana confronted him, he just smiled and said, "Beautiful kid. Be ashamed if something happened to her." A person can get awful distracted, worrying about family. Makes it hard to focus on business. That was the day she decided to give me up. The diagnosis of her early onset dementia, which she had been hiding and fighting, became her weapon. She called social services on herself. She engineered her own disappearance from my life. It was a calculated, heartbreaking act of maternal protection. The system that I had resented for so long had been the very thing that kept me safe. The anger I had felt towards her evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching respect. She wasn't a victim. She was a warrior. She had lost every battle but had found a way to win the war, to pass the final, most important decision on to me. Mixed in with the painful history were other letters. Letters filled with advice, with love, with hope for the person I would become. "Be kind, but not weak," she wrote in one. "Know the difference between a helping hand and a leash. Your heart is a garden, Maya. Tend it well, but don't be afraid to pull the weeds." In another, she wrote about the creamery itself. "Don't just see the rust and the dust. See the bones of it. Your grandfather built it to last. The steel is good, the foundation is solid. It's a good place. It has good bones." The more I read, the more the building transformed in my mind. It was no longer a menacing ruin. It was a legacy. It was the last standing piece of my family. The idea of letting Cascade Holdings bulldoze it, of letting Silas Croft win his decade-long war of attrition, became physically repulsive to me. But the money, $175,000. It was a constant, seductive whisper in the back of my mind. It was freedom. It was a fresh start, with no history, no debt, no fight. I could walk away and be normal. I was torn. My heart, newly broken and rebuilt by my grandmother's story, was telling me to stay, to honor her sacrifice, to fight. But my head, conditioned by years of instability and scarcity, was screaming at me to take the money and run. To survive. I felt like I was being pulled in two. The internal conflict was a physical weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I left the office and walked out onto the main factory floor. The sheer scale of the task was overwhelming. The dust, the broken equipment, the silence, and the $12,000 tax bill hanging over it all like a guillotine. How could I, a 19-year-old with no skills and no money, possibly save this place? It was a fantasy, a noble but ultimately suicidal gesture. I went back up to the apartment, the weight of the decision crushing me. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I just sat on the dusty floral sofa, staring at the boxy television, the two options warring in my mind. Stay and fight for a memory, likely losing everything and ending up on the street in 90 days. Or sell and walk away with a fortune, living with the knowledge that I had let my grandmother's last stand come to nothing. I felt a wave of despair so profound it was nauseating. I curled up on the sofa, pulling a dusty Afghan over me, and for the first time since I was a little girl, I felt utterly, hopelessly lost. The choice was too big. The weight was too heavy. I was just a kid. I wasn't strong enough for this. I wasn't my grandmother. I fell into a restless, dream-filled sleep. I dreamt of whirring machinery, of my grandfather's smiling face, of Silas Croft's empty eyes. I dreamt of Nana's hands, covered in flour, reaching for me. I woke up in the pre-dawn gray, shivering. The apartment was freezing. The despair of the previous night had settled into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I knew what I had to do. The smart thing. The sensible thing. I had to sell. It was the only way. I couldn't save this place. But maybe, just maybe, I could save myself. With the decision made, a strange, hollow calm settled over me. It wasn't relief, and it certainly wasn't happiness. It was resignation. I would call Arthur Albridge, tell him to accept the offer from Cascade Holdings, and begin the process of untangling myself from Black Creek forever. But before I did that, there was one last thing I needed to do. I went back to the office. The box of letters sat on the desk, a silent testament to the battle I was about to concede. I couldn't just leave them here to be bulldozed with the rest of it. They were the only real inheritance I had received. I began carefully packing them back into the cherrywood box. As I gathered the last bundle, my fingers brushed against the velvet lining at the bottom of the box. It felt loose. A small wrinkle in the fabric. Curiosity piqued. I pushed the fabric aside. Underneath, there was a false bottom. A thin piece of wood, perfectly fitted. My breath caught. I worked my fingernails into the seam and lifted it. Beneath the panel was a cavity. And inside that cavity were two things. Another sealed envelope and stacks of cash. My heart stopped. It was a brick of money, bound with rubber bands. Mostly hundreds and fifties. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. It was thick, heavy. And on the envelope, in Nana's familiar script, were two words, for the fight. I tore open the envelope. The letter inside was short, written on a single page, the handwriting shakier than the others, as if penned in a great hurry. Maya, my love, this is the last letter. If you have found this, it means you chose to look deeper, to not just accept the easy answer. This money is everything I had left. It is the last of my savings, scraped together over years, hidden from the banks and from Croft. It is not a fortune. I counted it just now. It is $15,000. It is enough to pay the back taxes and keep the county at bay for a little while longer. Or, it is enough for a plane ticket to anywhere in the world and a fresh start. A real one, with no strings attached. I do not want you to feel trapped by my fight. This money is my final gift to you, and it makes your choice real. If you take it and go, I will understand. You owe this place nothing. But if you choose to stay, if you choose to fight, use this. It won't be enough to fix everything, but it is enough to begin. The choice, as always, is yours. Know that whatever you decide, my love for you is absolute. Be brave. Your Nana. $15,000. I stared at the stacks of cash, then back at the letter. The hollow calm I had felt just moments before shattered, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and emotion so powerful it made me dizzy. This changed everything. The choice was no longer between certain failure and a fortune. It was now between a clean getaway and a fighting chance. A small chance, yes, A desperate, long shot, uphill battle of a chance. But it was a chance. The $12,000 tax bill was no longer an insurmountable mountain. It was a hurdle I could clear. I could buy myself time. I could stop the auction. I could face Cascade Holdings not as a desperate girl with nothing, but as the legal owner of the property, current on my taxes. I spread the money out on the dusty desk. It looked like a miracle. My grandmother, even as her mind was failing, had been playing chess. She had anticipated every move. She had left me the easy way out with the developer's offer. But she had also left me the tools to take the hard path, if I had the courage to choose it. I thought about the life I could have with the $175,000. An apartment, college, travel. A life of ease, a life without this cold, demanding building. Then I looked at the photograph of my grandparents. I thought of Silas Croft's smug, predatory smile. I thought of Nana's sacrifice, the years she had spent in silence, letting me believe the worst of her, all to keep me safe. Selling felt like an act of profound cowardice. Staying felt like an act of defiance. It felt like coming home. I stood there for a long time, the cold air of the office swirling around me, the two futures pulling at me. The easy life, or the meaningful one. Run or fight. I started laughing. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a wild, unhinged, incredulous laugh. Of course, there was never really a choice. Not for me. Not for Eleanor's granddaughter. I carefully stacked the $15,000, leaving out $12,000 for the taxes. The remaining $3,000 was more money than I'd ever had in my life. It was a start. I picked up the phone on the desk. There was no dial tone, of course. I'd have to use my cheap pay-as-you-go cell phone. I walked out of the office, through the silent factory, and up to the small apartment. I found my phone and dialed the number on Arthur Albridge's business card. He answered on the second ring. "Albridge, Arthur, it's Maya," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "I've made a decision." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "All right," he said, his voice neutral. "I'm here to listen. I'm not selling," I said. The words hung in the air, solidifying my choice. "I'm keeping the Creamery." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear the faint sound of him relighting his pipe. "Maya," he said slowly, "I have to advise you. That is a difficult path. The taxes, the state of the building, I know," I interrupted. "But I'm paying the taxes. All of them. Today. Can you help me with that?" There was a sharp intake of breath on his end. "You can? The full $12,000. "Yes," I said. "My grandmother, she made provisions." I heard him chuckle, a low, appreciative rumble. "Eleanor," he said, with what sounded like deep affection. "That woman. She always had one more card up her sleeve. Of course, I'll help you, Maya. Of course. Bring the funds to my office. We'll get a cashier's check and take it over to the county clerk's office ourselves. We'll make sure they know Cascade Holdings has lost their leverage. And Arthur?" I said, "Yes. When Cascade Holdings calls you about their offer, I want you to tell them something for me." "What's that?" "Tell them the Black Creek Creamery is not for sale. At any price." The next 48 hours were a blur of purposeful action. I walked to Arthur's office with $12,000 in cash tucked into the lining of my jacket, feeling like a spy in a movie. Arthur, bless his tweed-covered heart, didn't even blink. He simply nodded, counted the money, and then drove me in his ancient, rumbling Volvo to the county seat, a larger town about 30 minutes away. Walking into the county clerk's office and handing over a cashier's check for the full amount of the back taxes was one of the most terrifying and empowering moments of my life. The clerk, a bored-looking woman, stamped my receipt with a satisfying thud. Just like that, the guillotine was gone. The 90-day clock was reset. I owned the Black Creek Creamery. Free and clear, for the moment. On the drive back, Arthur was uncharacteristically talkative. "You know," he said, glancing over at me, "your grandmother would be so proud. She loved this town, but she felt like it was losing its soul. All these new developments, they're turning it into a playground for rich people from the city. They're tearing down the history. She never told me about any of it," I said quietly. "The Creamery, the fight. Nothing, that was the point," he said. "She wanted you to have a normal childhood. She didn't want to burden you with her battles. She carried it all herself. Until she couldn't anymore. When he dropped me off in front of the Creamery's massive gate, he handed me a slip of paper. "This is the number for a man named Gus. He's a retired contractor, lives just outside of town. He worked for your grandparents, back in the day. He's a good man. If you're serious about this, you're going to need help. You can't do it alone. He gave me a long, searching look. You've done the hard part, Maya. You made the choice. Now comes the work, the work. I stood in the cracked asphalt yard, looking up at the decaying behemoth. Arthur was right. The building was a mountain, and I was at the bottom with a teaspoon. But for the first time, I didn't feel despair. I felt a flicker of something else. Determination. I had $3,000, a roof over my head, and time. It was more than I'd had 3 days ago. I spent the rest of the day making a plan. I started with the apartment. I found cleaning supplies in a closet and scrubbed the small space from top to bottom. I washed the dusty sheets and the Afghan, hanging them on a makeshift line in the factory to dry. I cleaned the windows, letting in the weak afternoon light. It was a small act, but it made the space feel like mine. It started to feel like a home. The next day, armed with a new sense of purpose, I began to tackle the factory itself. I started with the office. I carefully packed away Nana's letters and the cherrywood box. Then, I began the monumental task of cleaning out the years of accumulated junk and trash. I found old work boots, stacks of yellowed newspapers, empty coffee cups with mold growing inside. It was archaeology of the most depressing kind. As I was hauling a bag of trash out to the yard, a dusty pickup truck pulled up to the gate. An older man with a weathered face, a kind smile, and hands like gnarled oak roots got out. "You must be Maya," he said, his voice a friendly rasp. "Arthur called me." "I'm Gus." It was the contractor Arthur had told me about. I was immediately on my guard. Years in the system had taught me to be wary of helpful strangers. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone more suspicious than I intended. He didn't seem offended. He just leaned against his truck and looked at the creamery. "I helped your granddad raise that steel," he said, pointing to the main structure. "Poured the concrete for the floor. Knew your grandmother since she was a girl. I heard you were trying to save the old place." "I'm trying," I said. "Heard you told Cascade Holdings to go pound sand," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "That took guts. Your grandmother would have liked that." He pushed himself off the truck. "Look, I'm retired. My back isn't what it used to be, but I know this building better than anyone. I've got some tools, and I've got time. If you'll have me, I'd like to help you get started. No charge. Consider it a debt owed to your grandparents." I stared at him, my suspicion warring with a desperate need for help. Nana's words came back to me. Know the difference between a helping hand and a leash. Gus's offer felt like the former. His eyes were clear, his offer simple. He wasn't asking for anything. He was offering to share the load. "Okay," I said, my voice small. "Okay." That afternoon, Gus became my guide to the ghost factory. He showed me the main water shutoff, the electrical panels, the labyrinthine system of pipes. He pointed out structural weaknesses and areas that were solid as a rock. He taught me the language of the building. "First thing," he said, standing in the middle of the cavernous processing floor, "is to stop the decay. We need to patch the roof where it's leaking and replace the broken windows. Get it sealed up before winter." The task seemed impossible. But with Gus there, it felt manageable. He broke it down into small, achievable steps. We spent the rest of the week making a list, measuring windows, and assessing the damage. The phone call came on a Friday afternoon. It was Arthur. His voice was grim. "Maya, I just heard from Cascade Holdings' lawyer. They're not happy," I figured. I said, my stomach tightening. "They're making a new offer. $500,000. I almost dropped the phone. $500,000. They're also letting it be known around town that if you don't accept, they'll use every legal and procedural tool at their disposal to make your life difficult. Zoning challenges, code violation complaints. They're going to try and bleed you dry with bureaucracy." It was the same strategy they'd used on my grandmother. "What do I tell them?" Arthur asked. I looked out the newly cleaned window of the apartment. Below, in the yard, Gus was unloading tools from his truck. The sun was setting, casting a golden light on the old brick walls. This place, this fight, it was part of me now. "Tell them the answer is still no," I said. The decision to reject $500,000 was, by any rational standard, insane. That number echoed in my head for days. It was the sound of a door closing on an easy life. But every time I felt a pang of regret, I would walk through the vast, silent creamery, and the feeling would fade. This was more than money. This was about reclamation. It was about honoring the past and building a future on my own terms. News of my refusal spread through Black Creek like wildfire. The town was small enough that secrets were a temporary commodity. When I went to the general store to buy supplies, I could feel the eyes on me. Some looks were pitying, as if I were a fool who had thrown away a winning lottery ticket. Others were curious. A few, however, were looks of quiet respect. June, the woman from the store, gave me a small discount on a new set of work gloves. For the fight, she whispered with a wink. Gus was a godsend. He was a patient teacher and a tireless worker. Together, we started the slow, arduous process of sealing the building. We climbed onto the flat, tar-papered roof and patched the leaks, one by one. We measured the broken windows and, using some of my precious $3,000, ordered custom-cut panes of thick glass. Gus taught me how to glaze a window, how to mix mortar, how to use a power drill without stripping the screws. My hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and stained with grime. My muscles ached in ways I didn't know were possible. But every evening, when I'd collapse onto the sofa in my small apartment, it was a good ache. It was the ache of accomplishment. One afternoon, as we were replacing a large window on the ground floor, a sleek black car pulled up to the gate. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and had the kind of polished, predatory look that set off every alarm bell in my body. He didn't approach the gate. He just stood there, watching us work, his arms crossed. Gus saw him and stiffened. "That's him," he muttered, his voice low and tight. "That's Silas Croft." My blood turned to ice. It was the first time I had ever seen him in person, but I knew him instantly from Nana's descriptions. He was the ghost that had haunted my family for decades. I wanted to run, to hide, but I was holding a heavy pane of glass. I had a job to do. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding, and focused on setting the glass into the frame. I refused to look at him. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. Gus and I worked in silence, our movements precise, our focus absolute. We were a team. After 10 long minutes, Croft got back in his car and drove away. He hadn't said a word, but his message was clear. "I'm watching you." That night, I couldn't sleep. The reality of what I was up against, the face of the man who had terrorized my grandmother, it was no longer an abstract concept from a letter. It was real. He was real. I was scared. But as I lay in the dark, listening to the old building groan and settle around me, I realized something. I wasn't alone in this fight. I had Arthur. I had Gus. I had the quiet support of people like June. And I had the building itself, this monument to my grandparents' dream. I was part of a story now, a story that had started long before I was born. My fear began to recede, replaced once again by that stubborn, cold resolve. The next morning, I woke up with an idea. The creamery was too big for one person. It was too big for artisanal cheese, at least for now. But it had space. Lots of it. Black Creek had a soul, as Arthur had said, but it was a town with very little for its people to do. The kids hung out at the gas station. The few local artists and craftspeople worked out of their garages. What if the creamery wasn't just my home? What if it could be a home for the community? I found Gus in the main processing room, surveying the network of pipes. "Gus," I said, my voice filled with a nervous energy. "I have a crazy idea." I laid it all out for him. We could clean out one of the large, secondary rooms. We could put in a new floor, paint the walls, run some new electrical. We could turn it into a multi-purpose space. A community hall. A place for art classes, for yoga, for a winter farmer's market. A place for the town to gather. Gus listened patiently, a thoughtful expression on his face. When I was finished, he was silent for a long time. I thought he was going to tell me I was crazy, that we didn't have the time or the money for such a project. "Your grandfather," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. He always wanted to do something like that. He said the creamery was for the town, not just for him. He wanted to have concerts here. Barn dances. He looked around the vast, dusty space, but I could tell he was seeing something else. He was seeing the dream. He turned back to me, and there were tears in his eyes. "It's a good idea, Maya. It's the right idea. Let's do it." The work took on a new meaning. We weren't just saving a building anymore. We were building a future. We focused our energy on one of the large storage rooms at the front of the building. It had its own entrance and good natural light from a series of high windows. We scrubbed the walls, tore out the old, rotting shelves, and patched the concrete floor. My remaining money dwindled as we bought paint, lumber, and lighting fixtures. Every purchase was a gamble, a bet on a future that was far from certain. But as the room began to transform, something amazing happened. People started to show up. First, it was a couple of teenagers who had heard what we were doing. They offered to help paint in exchange for a place to practice with their band. Then a local woman who was a potter asked if she could rent a small corner to set up her wheel. A young farmer who grew organic vegetables asked if he could use the space for a pop-up market on weekends. The creamery was coming back to life, not with the hum of machinery, but with the sound of voices, of music, of community. It was messy and chaotic and beautiful. I was no longer just the strange girl who had inherited the town's biggest ruin. I was the girl who was bringing it back. The fight with Cascade Holdings was far from over. Their lawyers sent letters. The town's code enforcement officer, a man clearly in their pocket, paid us several visits, citing us for minor, ridiculous violations. But with Arthur's legal guidance and Gus's construction expertise, we navigated each new obstacle. And with every challenge we overcame, the community's support grew stronger. They saw that we weren't giving up. They saw that this wasn't about making a quick buck. It was about building something real. Months have passed since that first day I stepped off the bus in Black Creek. It's winter now, and the coastal range is shrouded in a constant, gentle rain. The creamery is still a work in progress. It will be for a long time. Most of the building is still cold and dark, a sleeping giant waiting for its time. But the front section, our community space, is alive. On weekends, the farmer's market fills the hall with the smell of fresh bread and winter greens. The Potter's Corner is a cheerful, dusty mess. The teenagers' band, now named the Creamery Rejects, practices twice a week, their loud, joyful noise echoing through the old building. It's not a fortune. I'm broke, most of the time. I make a little money from renting out space, enough to pay the bills and buy groceries. I wear secondhand clothes and my boots are worn through. By the world's standards, I am the opposite of a success story. I turned down $500,000 to live in a cold, half-derelict building in the middle of nowhere. But I have never felt richer. I found more than just letters and old machinery in this place. I found my history. I found a purpose. And I found a family, pieced together from a gruff lawyer, a kind-hearted contractor, and a town full of people who were just waiting for a reason to come together. My grandmother left me a choice. And in choosing the harder path, the path of the fight, I chose to become the person she always hoped I would be. The inheritance wasn't the building or the money. It was the strength I found in myself when I decided to stay. It was the understanding that a home isn't something you're given. It's something you build, nail by nail, act by act, day by day. The other night, I was standing on the catwalk overlooking the dark, silent factory floor. The moonlight was streaming in through the newly paned windows, illuminating the great steel vats. They didn't look like ghosts anymore. They looked like promises. I don't know if I'll ever make cheese here. I don't know what the future holds for the Black Creek Creamery, or for me. The fight with Cascade Holdings continues, a slow, grinding war of attrition. But I know we will not lose. Because we are not just fighting for a piece of land anymore. We are fighting for the soul of a town. We are fighting for the idea that our history is worth saving, that community is worth more than profit, and that a second chance can bloom in the most broken of places. My name is Maya. I am 19 years old, and I am home. This story started with loss and ended with a different kind of inheritance. It's a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things we're given are not things at all, but responsibilities, choices, and the chance to build something that matters. Have you ever had to make a choice between the easy path and the meaningful one? What did you choose, and what did it teach you? Share your story in the comments below. I'll be reading them, because your stories matter. This channel is a place for people who have been through the fire and are learning how to build a life from the ashes. It's for people who understand that our past doesn't have to define our future. If that's you, if these are the stories you need to hear, then please subscribe and become part of this community. You are not alone in your fight. Thank you.
Just, oh my god, yeah. This is honestly so satisfying. Who's your favorite Pokemon? Honestly, Ishimaru, it's a tie between Pikachu which I know is basic, but I do love me Pikachu. And delivered. And I don't think they have delivered in game, but maybe during Christmas or something they'll add them in. Okay. Let's see. Also, the picking up thing with the Kirby method, so nice. Okay, let's do... Also, hi Julie. Thanks so much for the heart me. Appreciate it. Pikachu's really adorable, and ooh, yes, let's hope minus Psyduck. Oh, Psyduck's great. Psyduck is actually in the game. I have him living in a beach spa at the moment. How are you, my friend? I'm great, Julie. Doing much better than yesterday since my allergies have calmed down. How about you? God, so much Pokemetal. This is great. Also, because like to print off like one piece of furniture takes 10 Pokemetal. I was like, that's crazy. At least they give you like good opportunities like this to just like get as much as you need.